The restaurant was the kind of place people whispered about before they ever stepped inside. Polished stone floors that reflected the chandeliers like mirrors. Soft music you barely noticed unless it stopped. Tables spaced wide enough to protect conversations that didn't want to be overheard. This wasn't a place you walked into by accident. It was a place you arrived at. Every face inside looked practiced, tailored jackets, quiet confidence, eyes trained to notice who belonged and who didn't. That's when the doors opened again. A man walked in with his family. No entourage, no announcement, no rush. He wore simple clothes, clean, neat, unremarkable. Nothing that screamed wealth, nothing that demanded attention. He held the door open, waited for his family, and stepped aside as if he had all the time in the world. A few heads turned, then a few more. Not because he looked important, but because he didn't. In a room built on status, simplicity stood out. They paused near the entrance, scanning the room, not searching for approval, just orienting themselves. The man placed a gentle hand on his child's shoulder, leaned down, said something quietly that made the child nod and smile. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but not to everyone. From across the room, a waiter noticed them and stiffened. His eyes traveled from their shoes to their clothes, then back to their faces. His expression changed, not confusion, but calculation. The kind people make when they've already decided something without asking a single question. He approached quickly, too quickly. His tone was sharp before he even reached them. "Excuse me," he said loud enough to carry. "This area is reserved." The man looked up, calm. "We're here to dine." The waiter didn't lower his voice. In fact, he raised it. "Sir," he said, glancing briefly at nearby tables, "this restaurant has standards." The word standards lingered in the air longer than it needed to. A few guests pretended not to listen. Others leaned back slightly, interested despite themselves. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't about seating. It never was. The man remained still. No argument. No reaction. The waiter gestured vaguely toward the door. "There are plenty of other places nearby that might be more appropriate." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that presses against your ears. The family froze for half a second. Just long enough to feel it. Just long enough for the insult to land. And still, the man said nothing. He didn't bristle. Didn't explain who he was. Didn't defend his family. He simply looked at the waiter, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if he were observing something rather than being targeted by it. That calm unsettled the room. Because anger would have made sense. Embarrassment would have been expected. But this felt different. A quiet promise hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The restaurant had been designed to impress people before they even tasted the food. Every surface was intentional. Marble that didn't just shine, it reflected status. Chairs upholstered in muted tones that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. Even the lighting felt selective, casting a soft glow that flattered suits, jewelry, and confidence built on money. This wasn't a place where people came hungry. It was a place where they came to be seen. Conversation stayed low, controlled. Laughter was measured, never loud. Glasses clinked softly, like punctuation marks in sentences no one wanted overheard. Waiters moved with precision, trained not just to serve, but to assess. They knew which tables required extra attention and which guests expected deference without asking for it. The room had rules, and everyone inside understood them. At the center table sat regulars, people whose names were known without introductions. Their jackets hung comfortably on chair backs, as if the space already belonged to them. They spoke with the casual ease of people who never wondered whether they were welcome. Closer to the edges sat those still proving themselves, new money visiting executives, couples celebrating something expensive. They watched the room carefully, mirroring the behavior of those who clearly outranked them. And then there were the staff. They were trained to smile, but not equally. Trained to prioritize, but never explain why. Here service followed hierarchy, not fairness. A quiet system, invisible to outsiders but obvious to anyone who'd spent time in places like this. Status decided everything. Which table you were offered, how long you waited, whether your presence was questioned or accepted without a word. That's why the family near the entrance felt out of place to some people. Not because they were loud, not because they were rude, but because they didn't perform wealth the way this room expected. They stood calmly, taking in the atmosphere without urgency. No impatience. No entitlement. The man didn't scan the room searching for recognition. He didn't signal for attention. He didn't even look bothered by the pause. To a room obsessed with appearances, that composure was confusing. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion and whispered something. The companion glanced over briefly, then looked away, as if distancing himself from a situation he didn't want to be part of. Another guest lifted a glass slowly, eyes flicking toward the entrance before returning to the conversation, curiosity masked as indifference. Judgment moved faster than conversation ever could. In places like this, people didn't ask who you were, they decided. The waiter who had spoken earlier hadn't acted alone. His confidence came from the culture around him. From knowing that here, he was protected by the unspoken agreement that some people belonged, and others needed permission. He'd enforced the rules the way he'd been taught, quickly, publicly, and without apology. The irony was that no one stopped him. Not the guests, not the staff, not even the manager, who hadn't yet noticed what was unfolding. Because moments like this happened more often than people liked to admit. They just didn't usually feel this heavy. The man stood quietly with his family, his presence calm enough to feel deliberate. He wasn't shrinking. He wasn't posturing. He looked like someone who had learned long ago that real authority didn't need to announce itself. That contrast, between the room's loud luxury and his quiet control, created an unease no one could quite explain. A server passed by with a tray, slowed for half a second, then continued on. A guest shifted in their seat. Someone cleared their throat unnecessarily. Small signals that something was off, even if no one wanted to name it. Because this restaurant thrived on certainty. And suddenly there was doubt. Doubt about whether the rules had been applied correctly. Doubt about whether the judgment had been fair. Doubt about whether this was the kind of mistake people would later wish they'd noticed sooner. The man finally looked around the room, not searching, not challenging, just observing, as if he were studying the dynamics, the unspoken hierarchy, the way power moved without words. His family remained close, unshaken, no embarrassment, no panic, just quiet patience, and that patience felt dangerous. Because patience suggested confidence, and confidence in a place like this usually meant something. Still, no one intervened. The room waited, and in that waiting, the tension began to stretch, slowly, deliberately, like a wire pulled tighter with every passing second. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. They just didn't know what yet. Before we go on, tell us honestly, at this point, who do you think is in the wrong here? The waiter returned with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Not confidence earned, confidence borrowed. It came from the room behind him, from the silent approval he believed he had already received, from knowing that no one had challenged him the first time. In places like this, silence was agreement. He stopped a few steps in front of the family, posture straight, expression tight. His smile was thin, practiced, and empty. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he said, louder than necessary. "You're blocking the entrance." The man looked at him calmly. "We're waiting to be seated." The waiter let out a short laugh, not friendly, not amused, a laugh designed to humiliate. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound condescending, "this isn't a waiting area. Reservations here are exclusive." The pause before exclusive was intentional. A couple at a nearby table stopped mid-conversation. Someone else turned slightly in their chair. The waiter noticed. He always did. Attention emboldened him. He glanced at the man's jacket again, then at his shoes, then back at his face, as if confirming a verdict already reached. "I don't want to make this awkward," the waiter continued, though his tone suggested the opposite. "But this restaurant caters to a certain clientele." The word certain landed like a slap. The family stood silently. The child shifted slightly, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. The man placed a steadying hand on his child's shoulder, his gaze never leaving the waiter. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, evenly. That question should have slowed things down. It didn't. The waiter's expression hardened. "The problem," he said, now fully projecting, "is that we have guests who follow our standards, and we don't have time to play guessing games." A murmur moved through the room. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a declaration. The waiter gestured again, this time more firmly toward the door. "There are plenty of family restaurants down the street." The implication was clear. You don't belong here. The insult wasn't subtle. It wasn't private. It wasn't accidental. It was public, deliberate, and designed to put the man in his place. For a moment, it seemed like someone might intervene. A server paused near the bar. A guest frowned. Another shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke, because stepping in meant choosing a side. And in rooms built on hierarchy, People rarely challenged the system that protected them. The waiter mistook that silence for victory. He straightened his posture, shoulders squared, voice sharpened. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time." The room went still. The man didn't move. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the waiter, calm, steady, unblinking. That look unsettled him. The waiter felt it, even if he couldn't explain why. His words came faster, harsher, as if speed could mask uncertainty. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's policy." Policy was his shield. Policy meant responsibility belonged to someone else. But the man's expression didn't change. The waiter's frustration leaked through. "If you can't afford to dine here, that's fine. Just don't waste our time." A sharp inhale echoed from somewhere in the room. The line had been crossed. The insult wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity. About reducing a family to an inconvenience. About speaking down to people who had done nothing wrong. The man's hand tightened briefly on his child's shoulder, not in anger, but in reassurance. He leaned forward slightly. Just enough to speak without raising his voice. "We'll wait," he said. 2 words. No challenge, no apology, no explanation. The waiter stared at him, stunned by the refusal to engage on his terms. He'd expected an argument, maybe anger, maybe embarrassment, but this was control. Guests watched closely now. The tension had shifted. What had begun as a display of authority was starting to look like something else entirely. The waiter felt it slipping. He took a step back, then forward again, unsure which move would restore his dominance. "You can't just stand there," he snapped. But the man could, and he did. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. The kind that made people uncomfortable, because it forced them to confront what they were witnessing. A power struggle. And only one side seemed desperate. The waiter finally turned away, muttering under his breath as he walked toward the manager's station. His confidence faltered with each step, replaced by irritation he couldn't shake. Behind him, the family remained exactly where they were, calm, composed, unmoved. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the room wasn't sure who actually held the power anymore. The silence that followed didn't feel empty, it felt intentional. The man stood exactly where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, as if movement itself would be unnecessary. His posture remained relaxed, shoulders loose, breathing slow and steady. Anyone watching closely could tell this wasn't hesitation, it was control. In most confrontations, there was a rhythm people expected. Voices rose, explanation spilled out, defensiveness followed accusation. It was a predictable exchange, one the waiter had clearly prepared for. But the man broke that rhythm by refusing to play along. He didn't justify his presence. He didn't appeal to fairness. He didn't demand respect. He simply waited. That waiting did something strange to the room. Without raised voices to focus on, people started noticing details they'd missed before. The way the man stood with his family subtly shielded behind him. The way his gaze never darted, never searched for approval or backup. The way his expression remained calm, not passive, not amused, just quietly alert. This wasn't the calm of someone unsure of himself. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly where he stood. A guest near the bar shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. Another glanced toward the manager's desk, then back at the family, as if expecting someone else to step in and resolve the tension. But no one moved. The waiter had retreated, but the atmosphere he'd created remained, hovering like static in the air. The man's silence began to speak for him. In places like this, silence usually meant submission. It meant you had nothing to say, no ground to stand on. But this silence was different. It wasn't shrinking, it was expanding. It filled the space where arguments usually lived. The family stayed close. The child looked up at the man briefly, then relaxed, reassured by his stillness. That small moment didn't go unnoticed by a woman seated nearby. She frowned, the discomfort on her face deepening. Because whatever this was, it didn't look like guilt. Time stretched. Seconds passed, then minutes. In that stretch of time, the room began to recalibrate. Conversations didn't resume. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The background music felt suddenly too loud, then too quiet. The man finally shifted his weight slightly, not in impatience but in comfort. A subtle signal that he wasn't going anywhere. That's when the realization began to form. People who felt threatened didn't wait like this. People who felt powerless didn't stand so openly exposed. People who had something to hide didn't invite scrutiny. This man wasn't hiding. He was allowing the situation to unfold on his terms. A server approached the manager quietly and whispered something. The manager glanced toward the entrance, then back at the server, brows knitting together. He looked again, this time longer. The man noticed but didn't react. He didn't straighten his jacket, didn't adjust his stance, didn't prepare for recognition. He simply observed. That restraint sent a ripple through the room, because it suggested confidence that didn't need validation. A man seated near the window leaned back and crossed his arms, eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but curiosity. He'd seen confrontations before. This didn't match any of them. There was no desperation here, no need to win an argument, no urgency to prove anything. The waiter reappeared briefly, hovering near the edge of the room, watching from a distance. His earlier bravado had drained away, replaced by uncertainty he couldn't disguise. He wasn't sure anymore whether he'd confronted the right person or made the wrong mistake. The man remained still. The silence grew heavier, but it no longer belonged to the waiter. It belonged to him. In that quiet, people began projecting their own assumptions onto the situation. Some wondered if the man was testing the restaurant. Others suspected he was waiting for someone important. A few sensed, without evidence, that this wasn't an ordinary family at all. But no one could explain why they felt that way. They just did. The man finally glanced down at his family, offering a small, reassuring nod. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to say, "This is fine." That single gesture carried more authority than any raised voice in the room. Because authority wasn't loud, it didn't need permission, it didn't rush, it didn't explain itself. It waited. And in that waiting, the balance of power quietly shifted. No one could point to the exact moment it happened. There was no announcement, no signal. But something had changed. The restaurant was no longer in control of the situation. The man was. And everyone in the room, whether they admitted it or not, could feel it. The room had changed, even if no one said it out loud. What had once been a place of controlled confidence now felt unsettled, like a perfectly arranged table someone had nudged, just enough to make everything feel off. Conversations that had flowed effortlessly earlier now came in fragments. Laughter sounded forced. Eyes kept drifting briefly, cautiously toward the entrance, toward the man who still hadn't moved. At first, people pretended not to notice. That was the instinct here. In elite spaces, attention was a currency, and no one wanted to spend it on the wrong situation. But curiosity has a way of breaking through etiquette. A woman at a corner table paused mid-sentence, her glass hovering inches from her lips. Her companion followed her gaze, then quickly looked away, as if caught staring. Across the room, a couple exchanged a glance. Silent communication passing between them without words. Something about this didn't add up. If the family truly didn't belong, why hadn't they been removed already? If the waiter was right, why did the man look so comfortable? Staff members felt it too. A server slowed while passing, eyes flicking toward the manager's station and then back to the entrance. Another adjusted their apron unnecessarily, a nervous habit betraying the calm they were trained to maintain. No one wanted to be involved, but no one could fully disengage either. This was no longer just an awkward moment. It was a test. Time continued to stretch, each second adding pressure. The man's silence had created a vacuum, and now the room was filling it with speculation. "Who is he?" Someone whispered. "I don't know," came the reply. But that waiter shouldn't have said that. That comment traveled faster than the music. Not everyone agreed, of course. A few guests remained rigid, arms crossed, expressions fixed. They were invested in the rules staying intact, in believing that appearances still meant everything here. If those rules failed, it meant the system they relied on wasn't as solid as they thought. But doubt had already crept in. The family stood together unshaken. The child leaned slightly against the man, relaxed, unafraid. That detail didn't escape notice. Fearless children usually meant fearless parents, or parents who had no reason to worry. A man near the bar exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He'd seen plenty of people try to bluff their way into places like this. This didn't feel like bluffing. This felt like patience. The waiter lingered at a distance, pretending to straighten menace that were already aligned. His eyes darted back and forth. He avoided direct contact now. Whatever confidence he'd had earlier had dissolved, replaced by something closer to regret. He was waiting too. Waiting to see whether the manager would back him or correct him. And that waiting was dangerous. Because if the waiter was wrong, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. The manager finally stood from behind the desk, smoothing his jacket as he did. He didn't rush, he didn't storm over. He moved with the careful pace of someone who sensed a problem, but didn't yet understand its size. That movement alone sent another ripple through the room. Guests straightened. Staff became alert. Even the waiter stiffened, bracing himself. The man noticed the manager's approach but didn't react. No change in posture. No shift in expression. No preparation for recognition. It was as if he were allowing the manager to see him exactly as he was, without introduction, without explanation. That confidence unsettled people more than arrogance ever could. The manager slowed as he got closer, his eyes scanning the family, then the waiter, then the surrounding guests. He could feel the tension even if he couldn't yet name its source. This wasn't just about seating. This was about judgment. The room held its breath. In that suspended moment, the power dynamics became painfully clear. The waiter, who had relied on policy and perception, now stood exposed. The guests, who had stayed silent, suddenly looked uncertain. And the man, still calm, still grounded, seemed to anchor the entire space without lifting a finger. The whispers stopped. Everyone waited for the next move, because whatever happened next wouldn't just resolve a misunderstanding. It would redefine who truly mattered in that room. And deep down, many of them already sensed the answer. Be honest, if you were sitting in that room, would you have spoken up or stayed silent? The manager stopped a few steps away from the family. Up close, the situation looked different than it had from across the room. The man wasn't defensive. He wasn't annoyed. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides, his attention fully present but unforced. The manager's eyes lingered for a moment longer than expected. Something about the man's posture felt familiar. Not in a personal way, more in a professional one. The kind of familiarity that comes from recognizing authority without being told where it comes from. The manager glanced toward the waiter. The waiter straightened immediately, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir," he began quickly, "there's been a bit of a situation. These guests don't have a reservation and—" The manager raised a hand. Not sharply, not angrily, just enough to stop him. That gesture alone shifted the air in the room. The manager turned back to the man. His voice softened, losing the practiced neutrality he'd used with other guests. "Good evening," he said. "May I ask your name, sir?" The question was simple, respectful. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at his family first, then back at the manager. "Stephen," he said calmly. The manager blinked. Once then his posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. His shoulders squared, not in authority, but in recognition. His expression tightened briefly, then reset into something closer to disbelief. "I'm sorry," the manager said quietly. "Did you say Steven Siegel?" The name didn't echo. It didn't need to. It moved through the room like a current. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the back. A glass paused mid-air. Conversations died instantly, as if someone had reached over and turned the volume knob all the way down. The waiter froze. Not figuratively, literally. His face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. He stared at the man, at Stephen, as if seeing him for the first time. As if the clothes, the calm, the silence suddenly rearranged themselves into something terrifyingly clear. The manager's tone shifted completely. "Sir," he said, now fully composed but visibly unsettled, "I had no idea you were here tonight. Please accept my apologies for what just happened." Stephen didn't respond immediately. He watched the manager the same way he'd watched the waiter earlier, calm, attentive, unreadable. The contrast was striking. Moments ago, the waiter had spoken loudly, confidently, publicly. Now the manager spoke quietly, carefully, every word measured. "I assure you," the manager continued, "this does not reflect our values. I will address this immediately." He turned toward the waiter. The waiter stiffened, his earlier arrogance replaced by panic. "I was just following protocol," he said, too quickly. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," the manager replied evenly. That was all it took. No shouting, no humiliation. Just the truth spoken plainly. The waiter's shoulders sagged. The room watched transfixed. This wasn't the explosive confrontation they'd expected. It was something far more uncomfortable. Accountability. The manager turned back to Stephen, lowering his voice again. "We have a private table available, sir. I'd be honored if you and your family would allow us to make this right." Stephen considered this. For a moment it looked like he might refuse. Not out of pride but principle. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "We didn't come here for special treatment," he said. "We came here to eat." The words landed harder than any insult had earlier. The manager nodded, swallowing. "Of course." Stephen glanced around the room. At the guests who had watched silently. At the staff who had waited for direction. At the waiter who now couldn't meet his eyes. You have a beautiful restaurant, Stephen continued. But respect shouldn't depend on recognition. Silence followed. The kind that made people shift uncomfortably because it felt personal. The manager nodded again. You're right. He turned to the waiter once more. You're done for the evening. We'll speak later. The waiter didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded and stepped back, his authority gone as quickly as it had appeared. Stephen placed a hand gently on his child's shoulder and addressed the manager one last time. We'll take a regular table. The manager hesitated, then smiled faintly.
Yes, sir.
As the family was led inside, something remarkable happened. People made space. Guests who moments ago had looked away now watched with quiet respect. Not awe, not excitement, recognition. The kind that comes when you realize you've just witnessed something rare. Not power used loudly, but power revealed through restraint. And for the first time that evening, the restaurant felt different, not because of who had arrived, but because of what had been exposed. The rest of the evening passed without spectacle. No raised voices, no dramatic exits, no whispered apologies delivered for show. Stephen and his family were seated at a regular table, nothing secluded, nothing elevated. Just a place like any other guest would have received if the rules had been applied fairly from the beginning. Menus were offered politely. Water was poured without hesitation. The service that followed was calm, professional, and noticeably careful. But something fundamental had changed. The waiter never returned. Not to apologize, not to explain, not to justify himself. He didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. Across the room, guests resumed their meals, but the earlier ease was gone. Conversations restarted. Yet they carried a different tone. Less confidence, more reflection. People spoke quieter now, not out of fear, but awareness. They had witnessed something uncomfortable. Not a celebrity moment, not a public takedown mirror. Stephen didn't acknowledge the shift. He didn't look around to confirm recognition. He didn't accept nods of respect or lingering stares. His attention stayed with his family, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. That restraint mattered, because it proved the point wasn't about status. It was about conduct. At a nearby table, a man who had earlier laughed softly at the confrontation sat silently, eyes fixed on his plate. A woman across from him broke the quiet. That wasn't about money, she said. That was about assumptions. He nodded slowly. In silence, the manager passed by once more, pausing briefly, not to interrupt, not to intrude, but to offer a simple, genuine apology. No performance, no excuses, just accountability. Stephen acknowledged him with a nod. Nothing more was required. The consequences, while quiet, were real. Policies would be reviewed, training would be adjusted. And one waiter would leave that night with a lesson he wouldn't forget. Not because he'd been embarrassed, but because he'd been exposed to the cost of careless judgment. But the most lasting impact didn't belong to the staff. It belonged to the room. People had seen how quickly respect could be misplaced, and how easily it could be reclaimed without force. They'd seen that dignity didn't announce itself, didn't defend itself loudly, and didn't need permission to exist. They'd seen that power didn't rush. It waited. Stephen finished his meal the same way he'd entered the restaurant, quietly. When it was time to leave, he stood, helped his family, and walked out without ceremony. No one stopped him. No one applauded. But several people watched him go with a different expression than before. Not curiosity, not judgment, respect. Because the real shift hadn't happened when his name was spoken. It had happened earlier, when he chose not to react the way everyone expected him to. That choice changed everything. It reminded the room that arrogance often hides behind policy, that confidence without humility collapses quickly, and that the strongest response to disrespect isn't escalation. It's composure. As the doors closed behind the family, the restaurant returned to what it had always been: elegant, exclusive, impressive. But it would never feel quite the same to those who had been there that night, because once you witness restraint outperform ego, you don't forget it. Which moment stood out to you the most? The insult, the silence, or the reveal? Tell us below. More powerful stories are coming, and your feedback helps shape what we share next.